All right. So we are indeed recording. And once again, good to see you all. If you have your audio or your video muted, please unmute it so I can see you and we can see each other and we can have some kind of connection today. So looking at the screen, our map check starting here at the top. This is today. We're going to go over chapter 9, which is inventory overview. And then looking ahead to Wednesday, we will not have a Zoom. We will have a quiz like we did before. That'll be on Canvas Quizzes. That'll open up at 10 a.m. and that'll be open till 1 minute before midnight. I'm going to put you on a 45-minute time limit. So just be aware that whenever you punch in to take that quiz, be ready to knock it out because you'll get 45 minutes to do it in the same amount of attempts as you did last time. Okay, here in the middle of the screen in this kind of in-between color is an entirely optional event. So I don't want anybody to think that this is required. I'm doing a presentation for the YCP Excel series, and the title is Leadership Through Crisis, and that's available on Zoom Wednesday night at 7 p.m. You should have received an email from YCP Activities with the contact information on if you want to sit in on that Zoom, how to do it. Again, it's entirely optional. So if you don't do it or if you do it, I'm not keeping a black book. It's always cool to see y'all. And of course, it'd make me that much more hyped if you were there. But that's up to you. That's going to be Wednesday night at 7 p.m. I do think it'll be recorded. So if you have something else you have to do, you have to work, you have another class, you have an exam, those kind of things, but you still want to check it out, then I bet it will be posted some date. And if you are interested, big or small, whether you can or can't attend, if you just hit me up on email, hey, how do I get a piece of this action? I will get that information to you. So that's on Wednesday. Again, it's not mandatory. Looking ahead to next week, we're going to have 2 Zoom sessions next week. This time, next Monday, we're going to talk about lean from chapter 10. And then a week from Wednesday, we're going to have our second Zoom on total quality management, both from chapter 10. So we'll have 2 Zooms next week. We won't have a quiz or anything else next week. And that's our map check that'll take us through next week. Before we begin, any questions on the map check? All right. Let's see here. I just want to do one more thing before we get going. Get my chat back up. All right, cool. And okay. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to just talk about inventory, types of inventory, purposes of inventory, balances that we seek to achieve, and then go through some key terms when it comes to inventory. Pretty straightforward. So let me get my other presentation up here. So this was a picture that I took no time recently because I haven't been at Home Depot for obvious reasons, but I took this about sometime last year. Of course, Home Depot probably looks pretty much the same. And the reason I took this picture was because I'm always thinking about value chain and things like that. And if you've been in Home Depot, which I'm sure all of you have, or Walmart or Lowe's, there's just inventory. You're surrounded by inventory. And each one of those items has a number of things associated with it. So while it may seem, and we often take this for granted, we just kind of walk by these items. We go into Home Depot, we look for those couple screws or that drywall or whatever it is we're looking for, and we get it and we get out of there. And that's all fine and good. But when we think about this from value chain, there's so much that goes into each one of those items that's on the shelf. And so today we're going to talk about some of the things that the thought process that goes into each one of those items as individual items and as a whole in terms of inventory. And there's a lot, not trying to overcomplicate it, but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And one of the big thoughts I had about Home Depot was, man, someone's got to manage all of these little tiny decisions for each one of these items. And we know that in the modern world, sure, there's software to help us do that. But again, there's more than meets the eye. So today we're going to peek behind the curtain and understand what you keep saying this, there's more than meets the eye. What all is involved with inventory, what kind of considerations from a business perspective, and the impact on the value chain. So with that, here's our agenda for this presentation. We're going to talk again about the types of inventory. There's 4 types. We're going to talk about the purpose of inventory. There's about 4 to 6 purposes of inventory, some which are probably very intuitive. They come to you right away, and others which I might not have thought of it that way. And then the 2 balances, trying to balance between customer satisfaction, the idea of always having the item on hand so that when you or someone else comes into Home Depot, you can get what you want and leave. And then the alternative to that, which is we could have spent the money on something else, and trying to achieve that balance. We also have what I call the second balance, which is some of the costs involved with inventory, holding costs and ordering costs. And we'll talk about that. And then finish up with some key terms behind inventory management. So when we talk about types of inventory, we can think of this from upstream to downstream. That is the easiest way we can think about the types of inventory. So if we look here on the screen, excuse me, and I always like to start with the left hand of the slide being upstream, remember, back into our suppliers. One type of inventory are those raw materials. So in this example, we're making motorcycles. And within any motorcycle, whether it's Harley Davidson, Indian, Triumph, Kawasaki, there's a number of raw materials, steel, rubber, and then parts and components that probably a number of suppliers go into. For all I know, Harley Davidson has, once we trace that supply chain all the way upstream, they may have 46 suppliers for one individual motorcycle. So raw materials are a type of inventory. Let's talk about the other obvious type of inventory, which is the finished good itself when we're talking about products. So in this example, it would be the actual motorcycle. We might have a motorcycle in the production plant. Usually the finished goods get moved out to some type of either retail location or to the customer or the consumer themselves, if we're doing a direct type of distribution. A car dealer usually has an amount of cars on hand. You drive past the car dealer, you see an amount of cars in the lot. So finished goods, we often think of this in terms of type of inventory. The picture that I started off with all those bottles and cans and everything on the shelf, that's finished goods. Now, 2 other types of inventory. So we have a total of 4. 2 other types are less intuitive than the first 2 that we talked about. When I say intuitive, they don't naturally come to mind. So we need to think about them and make sure we understand them. The first is work in progress. So when we think about operations, remember, operations is the component of the supply chain, the function in between sourcing and distribution farther downstream. So, for example, at the end of the day, let's say Harley Davidson is producing, let's just say that for whatever reason, Harley Davidson is only doing 1 shift. They're doing a day shift, maybe 8 to 8 or something like that. And so at 8 o'clock at night, when they're done and the whistle blows, they're not going to end on an even motorcycle. They're going to have motorcycles that are some way through the transformation process. Let's just say, for example, they have a motorcycle that's halfway done. Maybe it doesn't have the wheels on it yet. It doesn't have the gas tank on it yet, whatever. Well, they're still going to count that motorcycle in their daily count of inventory, because the next day when they come back at 8 o'clock, they're going to pick that half-finished motorcycle up and make it into a whole motorcycle. So to not count that item as part of an inventory would be kind of silly. And so we call that type of inventory work in progress. Okay, because again, to not account for it, we really would have an inaccurate account of how many motorcycles we have in a system at any given time. So work in progress is simply somewhere in between the start and the end of the transformation process is that product. Now, the fourth type of inventory is probably the most difficult, I think, in my experience, for people to understand. And that is MRO. So materials, repair, and operations. And that definition really doesn't do much to tell us what it is. The way I like to think of it is inventory that we need to keep the transformation process going. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's say in this picture, we have these machines. We have these, she's doing, it's probably some kind of power drill that she's using right there. And this power drill and this machine probably requires some kind of lubricant, maybe compressed air, maybe some other kind of supply to keep her sustained so she can do the function of the assembly line that she's doing all day repeatedly. So in that example, compressed air that goes into this machine would be an example of MRO inventory. There might be a tank somewhere that feeds into this machine that provides compressed air. And somebody in that plant probably has the job every day of going around and monitoring the level of compressed air. Let's talk about an even simpler example. Let's suppose we had a printing plant. So we have a copier that probably has some parts that break every now and then, and we need to replace the parts on the copier so that we can keep printing going. Now, what's the significance of this blue line? Well, the blue line is my technique on how to convey this concept more cleanly. And the bottom line with MRO is that it sustains the transformation process, but it's not part of the item itself. So, for example, let's say that with the motorcycle, I have the compressed air. Well, the compressed air is not part that helps her use that power drill all day long. Well, the compressed air is not part of the motorcycle. I'm not talking about the air that goes into these tires. I'm talking the air that runs that power drill that helps her put on components. So the compressed air is not part of the motorcycle, and therefore it makes most sense that it's MRO. All right. The hubcap or the spokes or whatever components of the wheel, that's actually part of the motorcycle. When a motorcycle leaves the production plant and goes farther downstream, that spoke and that wheel assembly is going with the motorcycle. So to differentiate between raw material inputs, those are staying with the finished goods. They're part of the transformation process, and on the output, they're staying with the finished good. The MRO is really just sustaining the ability to produce the finished good. So the compressed air that goes into that machine is not driving away with the motorcycle when it leaves. It's staying within the machine. So when you're looking at inventory, and I ask you, Maggie, what type of inventory is this? And you start getting confused between raw materials and MRO, just ask yourself, is this type of material going to be part of the finished product? Or is this type of material being used to sustain the production of the product? Depending on the answer you come up with will lead you to the type of inventory it is. Okay. So first things first, make sure you've got these three types of inventory down, and then seek to differentiate with examples of MRO and raw materials. But the bottom line is that we have 4 different types of inventory. And the type of inventory that you or someone within the value chain is concerned about depends on where they work within the value chain. So folks that are working distribution down at retail or wholesalers or distributors, they're dealing with finished goods. Folks that are working with sourcing and purchasing, they're concerned with raw materials. Folks that are working in operations are concerned about work in progress. They're probably also concerned about raw materials on hand that would sustain that work in progress. And then folks in operations are also very concerned about MRO because that's what they need to keep this thing going. Okay, moving along. So once we understand the types of inventory, we can go on to what is the purpose of the inventory in the first place? Well, it kind of depends on the type of inventory that we're talking about. But if we start with a finished good, here we have a Lego set of a Batmobile. Not that anybody would ever want such a thing. But when you go to the store to buy that Lego set of the Batmobile for your cousin or your niece or yourself, you expect it to be on hand. And so from a retail perspective, one of the reasons we have inventory on hand is because we want to sustain customer expectations and the customer demand. And the opposite of that is we want to prevent what's called a stock out. When someone comes to the store, especially nowadays with not just coronavirus, but prior to coronavirus, with internet retail and Amazon and really Amazon and just distribution capabilities being just as viable and competitive as retail locations. With that going on, when you go to a store nowadays, you expect it to be there. And so we have to make it, the retailer has to make decisions about what do I think that customer expectation and more specifically that demand is. So is the market that great? Do I need to have 20 Batmobile sets on hand or only 5? That kind of thing. It's obviously not the same for everything. And so we have to make decisions about that. Maybe if I had some other kind of model set, it's just not in as high a demand, so I shouldn't have that many on hand. I remember when Toys R Us went out of business and I took my son there just to kind of see what was there. All the shelves were barren, but I don't know what was up with Iron Man because there was like 20 Iron Mans on the shelf. And my son said, "What's going on with that?" I said, "Well, Iron Man's not Batman, so otherwise Batman would have been sold out." But anyway, it's not really the best example. Let's talk about other reasons why we have inventory. We also want to sustain production. So here we're talking about raw material inventory. So in this particular picture, we're making shoes. So we think about all the materials that go into making shoes. We need rubber, we need stitching, we need thread, we probably need some kind of vinyl. We might need some other things. So let's suppose that we had all these people on hand, all this labor force ready to go, especially in nowadays, which is a big deal that we've got the labor force there. but we didn't have all the raw materials on hand that we needed for that production run. So we would have a problem with that. So we need to have raw materials on hand so that we can keep that production run going. If we're making 5,000 shoes, we need to figure out what volume of raw material we need to make 5,000 shoes. And then we need to account for things like, let's say that we have a machine that every so often breaks a lace when it's installing it, or breaks a stitch when it's installing it, or damages the shoe when it's installing it. This kind of thing happens. No process, very few processes are error proof. So we need to have that additional raw material inventory on hand so that production doesn't grind to a halt and we still meet our production goals. So again, between these two examples, these are examples where we're talking about different types of inventory. And so we have a purpose that's related to where we are relative to our position on the value chain. And on that note, a general reason that we have inventory on hand is to preserve the independence throughout the value chain, which is a lot of words at once. We can encapsulate all this concept into a fancy word called decoupling, which, if we were on Jackson Street, would be some cool Jackson Street knowledge. Again, maybe somehow we're there virtually. Here's what I'm talking about. So let's just look at this. So let's take the example I just talked about. Here, we're accomplishing the operations, the transformation process. And let's say that Nick is our supplier and Andrew is in charge of operations. So Andrew has his labor force there. He has all his machines ready to go. He's going to have a great production day, but he's counting on Nick to show up with the raw materials he needs. Well, for whatever reason, on this particular day, Nick is not having a great day and his truck breaks down. So that means that Andrew is standing there or sitting there with his entire labor force, and they're all just kind of standing at each other or staring at each other. And so time goes on, and the whole time that people are standing there not producing, Andrew is losing money. That's under the assumption that Andrew doesn't have any buffer inventory. So let's suppose that Andrew did. Andrew had a buffer inventory. And so Nick calls him up and says, "Hey, Andrew, I'm going to be about 3 hours late." And Andrew says, "Well, I'm not happy about that, but we're going to start production anyway." So he pulls out of his buffer inventory, which we have another name for, and I'll get to that in a second. And he continues and starts production. And then when Nick arrives, Nick, instead of taking that inventory to the production line, he replaces the buffer inventory. And so what Andrew has done is he has decoupled himself and made himself less dependent on Nick's arrival. Let's take this concept farther down the supply chain. So let's say that Brenna is a retailer down here, and she's in charge of distribution as well. And so Andrew calls her and says, "Hey, let's say that Andrew didn't have buffer inventory, or let's just forget about Nick and talk about Andrew and say that Andrew, for whatever reason, started production late. And so he's putting together all those Batmobile Lego sets. And Brenna calls him up and says, "Hey, we're going to have a pickup on time. I'm responsible for getting the trucks there to pick up these finished Lego sets so I can get them out to the store tomorrow. So when the store's open, the Lego sets will be there." And Andrew goes, "Yeah, about that. Kind of got a problem. Started production 3 hours late. So no, they're not going to be ready by the time you come pick up." Well, if Brenna has an extra set of Lego Batmobile sets, either from a wholesaler or a distributor, she goes, same kind of thing. "Okay, Andrew, I'm not real excited about that, I still want these Lego sets when they're available. So I'm going to pull these buffer sets out and I'm going to stock the stores with those so that I don't miss my timeline, and all that hype we did about this Batmobile Lego set doesn't go to waste. Because if Brenda didn't do that, customers are going to show up to the store. They expect to get the Batman Lego set. It's not there. And they're like, to hell with this. I'm going to order online, or I'm going to go to another store. So that's a long example of preserving independence throughout the value chain. And we call that, a fancy name for that is decoupling. Okay. Now, by now, you all are smart enough that you're probably going, this buffer that Dr. Shatzkin keeps talking about, that sounds like safety stock. And it is. So another reason we have inventory within the supply chain is to serve as a buffer against uncertainty. And we call this safety stock. And we could have safety stock in, I wouldn't say that we'd have safety stock in terms of work in progress, but every other type of inventory, we could have a safety stock. Let's look at some examples. So in terms of raw materials, remember I talked about when you're producing stuff, stuff is going to break, okay? So let's say we're putting together computers, we might break a bolt, or we might be putting together cars or trucks, things like that. We're probably going to break bolts. We're probably going to lose washers. Hopefully not, but we're probably going to do that along the way. So we probably want a buffer stock of those little items that often break so that we don't stop production. Another example of a buffer stock, safety stock of raw materials, this is not from York Container, but it's about the same thing I saw when I visited York Container this past fall. They've got these huge drums of paper. What York Container does is they produce boxes. Everything from the candy bar boxes that you see in Rutter's to boxes in the liquor store. They have a cool box that looks like a clock for Anheuser-Busch. And within their warehouse, they have a certain section that is filled to the ceiling of paper. Now, on a side note, I'm not really sure why they had so much paper, because trucks come like every day. And that, to me, didn't strike me as a very uncertain environment. Okay. But I think they'd have the paper there so long because it was like a safety blanket. They felt good. They felt like, hey, no matter what, if for some reason the trucks don't show up, we have all this paper on hand. We can keep production going. They were very much a production biased business, in my opinion. And sometimes that's what happens. On the flip side of that, you can think of how much money that costs. They could do something else and put something else there. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now here you've got an example of a very popular item, a finished good, to have a safety stock of now, both at a retail location, as a wholesaler, and probably as your personal family. I know our family, about every couple of days, my wife asks me, how many rolls of toilet paper do we have in a closet? And I go through and I kind of count. So that's an item, again, right now that we definitely want to have a safety stock of, because when we go down to Weiss or Giant, last couple of times she's been there, there hasn't been any there. And then the last personal example I have up here is ink. So again, going back to why do we need ink? Well, it depends. Ink could both be a raw material or a part of MRO. So I know now that we're operating from home, my son needs to print out stuff daily. My wife needs to print out stuff daily. Is that part of the product? Not so much. They usually need these handouts to do something else. For me, I need to print out handouts so that for my classes, I have notes ready to go that I can refer to while I talk. So in that instance, I'm delivering a service. The ink isn't so much part of the service, but I need the ink to sustain the service. Okay, so in all instances, and and another side note, printer ink in my mind is kind of a, I don't know if you've experienced this, but you're like, all I want to do is print a black and white copy, but your copier will tell you it can't do it because it's out of red ink. That's how printers stay in business until one of you invent a printer that doesn't have that requirement. And I know you all have the capability to do that. So anyway, to make a long story short, safety stock is that buffer against uncertainty. And so just to drive the point home, when I don't have a lot of uncertainty in my environment, then I probably don't need much safety stock, if any safety stock at all. So for example, let's talk about your container very briefly again. Your container, their supplier of paper would come by like every 2 days and bring, it's kind of like the ice cream truck that drives down the street playing music. And you're like, oh, there's the ice cream truck. In the summer, you could set your watch by this. Every 3 o'clock every day, the ice cream truck comes by. Well, every 2 days, the paper guy would come by your container. I mean, you could set your clock by it. So why they have all this additional stock on hand, I don't really know. Potentially, it's a waste of money. Now, there's a price for peace of mind, and they might say, hey, we're willing to pay that for peace of mind. But we talked about certain environments before. Harley Davidson, they essentially require their supplier to locate across the street. If you go to Harley Davidson's production plant today, you will not find a big buffer stock or safety stock of parts. You probably will find just the opposite, literally, that they have just the items they need on the shop floor. And the reason for that is anything above that is a waste of money to them because they have so much certainty about their environment. So safety stock, the amount on hand really has to do with the amount of uncertainty in the environment. If I have an unreliable supplier, I'm going to have a higher level of safety stock. If I'm not sure about what demand is downstream, one day it's 50, the next day it's 500, the next day it's 5,000, I probably want a lot of safety stock downstream so I can deal with those fluctuations in demand. But if my downstream demand is 500 every day, there's really not much of a reason for me to carry any safety stock at all. I should just have 500 every day. So those are things to think about. Okay, moving on to another purpose of inventory that maybe doesn't come into mind right off the bat, and that is simply an economic discount. So regardless of demand and how much I need, sometimes, usually suppliers will just give us a good deal. So I remember one time early on in our relationship, my wife came home one day with 300 coffee filters. And she was so excited. She said, holy cow, this only cost me $2. And I was like, that's awesome. And we weren't big coffee drinkers back then. And I was like, how long is it going to take us to get through 300 coffee filters? But in her mind, the logic was, hey, I got a good deal on this. And as it just so happens, coffee filters don't really take up a whole lot of space. So it probably was a good deal. And so sometimes suppliers, especially in bulk, they offer good deals, and it makes sense just to buy it up regardless of demand. There are some industries that really lend itself to this. So to take, I'll do two examples and then we'll get back up on track. One example is the defense industry. And so the defense industry very much operates with, they'll produce, like, let's say, a new vehicle. And within that vehicle's construction on any given day, there's probably about 40 defense contractors that have contributed to that vehicle. And the way the Department of Defense works is they'll buy up as many repair parts that go to that vehicle at the start. And the smart suppliers will offer discount deals. Hey, if you buy 2,000 of these, we'll cut the price to you 50% kind of thing. Because particularly like with Afghanistan, we produced a lot of vehicles that we used for Afghanistan only, and we used in Iraq only, and we actually ended up giving back to the Iraqi army. So again, that's an example of an economic discount. Another kind of industry example that's closer to home is ollies. You see ollies around here. When I do have gone out, I've seen ollies is still up and running, which kind of makes me wonder if ollies is an essential business, but I won't get into that. The point there is that ollies is all about the economic discount. That's the business that they're in. So when we visited ollies last year, they were talking about wedding dresses. They actually had wedding dresses in stock because they had a supplier who had made some mistake in manufacturing, and they couldn't sell these wedding dresses. So they were essentially selling them at 30% of cost, and Ollie's bought them all up. So that is Ollie's whole business model. For all I know, they never stocked wedding dresses again. And Ollie's will tell you that if we stock one item one time, that's probably, it very well may be that we never stock that item again. So, but a lot of other industries do this as well. And suppliers, offer economic discounts all the time, buy in bulk. So that's one more reason of inventory. I might not need it today, but I got a good deal on it. And as long as holding it doesn't tear me up in terms of cost, then why not? Which takes us, so remember that on holding cost, we'll talk more about that concept of holding cost here in 2 slides. So here we get into a couple of balances when we're talking about inventory. And when I say balance, it's a trade-off. That's one way to think about it. So the first balance is the balance between customer satisfaction and what we could have spent on that inventory that wasn't what we did. So for example, number 2 pencils. Let's talk about the YCP bookstore. When any one of you goes into the YCP bookstore, let's say you have a test, or let's just pretend like this was 4 months ago, and you have a value chain test coming up. You know that I'm going to ask you to do a Scantron. Your roommate stole your last number 2 pencils, so you're down there at the cafeteria and say, I'll swing by the bookstore and I'll get a number 2 pencil. Well, of all the items that are in the bookstore, when you walk in, you expect, there might not be stereo speakers, there might not be a Spartan Halloween shirt, but by gosh, you expect that number 2 pencil to be on hand. And that is what we call a very high service level. And probably if you ask the bookstore, John Gallo, the manager down there, I don't know if he's there these days or what they're doing, John would probably tell you, because he's an old ops warrior, and he would say, hey, we have a 99% service level. That means that 99% of the time when a student walks in, a warrior walks in to get a number 2 pencil, we hold ourselves accountable to have that on hand. Well, that makes sense for a number 2 pencil, but think about the other things that are in the store, in the bookstore. Hats, a ton of sweatshirts, some golf shirts, maybe some stereo speakers, mouse pads. The demand for these things are not necessarily all as high as a number 2 pencil. They have some specialty art supplies. And so there's probably a different service level for each one of those. If they stocked all of those at 100% or 99% service level, they'd probably go out of business. And here's why. Very common sense. The bookstore has other costs they need to cover. They need to spend money on marketing, for example. Let's get away from the bookstore for a second. And any business that's out there, they need to invest in other things. So they need to put money away and grow money. And heck, we could have just taken a gamble somewhere, whether we went down to the casino or we bet on a horse or we expanded our business. But we can't just spend all of our money on inventory. Sometimes we have to take risk. So for example, we have to say, well, we'd love to have all sorts of computer speakers at the bookstore, but they're just not going to move. So let's say that we spent a lot of money on inventory for computer speakers in the bookstore, and they just sat there and collected dust. After about 6 months, we'd go, man, we could have spent the money that we spent on those computer speakers on something else over here. We could have taken that money and put it into a CD or a mutual fund or into better marketing or something like that. And this is the whole guessing game and the balance of inventory. You can't just buy everything that you think should be in inventory because money is not unlimited. And you see this, there's certain times throughout the year that the bookstore has these crazy deals like such and such is 40% off. Usually that's because they kind of made probably some unbalanced decision. They bought too much of that sweatshirt. They overestimated what demand would be. And now they're coming to realize that sweatshirt is not moving. And generally, inventory that does not move is a bad thing. Safety stock is in a little bit of a different category. The best example of this is perishable items. So a grocery store that has milk that does not move, we all know what the end of that story is, which it is expires. That's bad news. Okay, so if I bought a whole bunch of milk, more milk than what customer demand was for, at a certain point, I've got to do something with that milk that becomes expired. And I can donate it. I can give it to discount stores. At the end of the day, eventually I just got to pour it out. And in all those instances, even if I give it away, I might get a tax write-off, but I'm losing money. So it all comes back to this balance. And again, this decision-making process for a number 2 pencil is probably different than it is for the computer speaker or some other item. So that's the first balance, or one of the balances that I have to keep in mind with inventory. And that's where I say that Home Depot, it's just not as simple as it seems. Now, one of the other balances I have to make is between these 2 buckets of cost. So holding cost and setup or ordering cost. Okay, so let me talk about what holding costs are. So holding cost is just that. That's what it costs me to hold the item in inventory at the location that I'm at, or whatever location is nearby that is holding the inventory for me. So one of the costs, a component of holding costs, is warehousing costs. So I have to pay for the people who manage the warehouse, who go around and count and say, they pull an item out of inventory and they go, okay, there's supposed to be 400 of these in this location, and they count and they say there's 400 of those. And then they go on to another item and they say there's supposed to be 20, and they count and they make sure that there's 20. So that all costs money. Another example of this is where I have items that need to be secure. Weapons parts is one of my favorite examples of this, because I'm not just going to have weapons parts just loosely around in a warehouse. I'm probably going to get shut down by some kind of code or law. So I've got to have security. I've got to have cameras up. I've got to have people that are licensed and certified to do this. Pharmaceuticals is another great example. Security is huge with pharmaceuticals because of the drug industry and the not so good drug industry, the black market, and people that are trying to steal drugs and high-end pharmaceuticals like Xanax and other things like that and sell them on the black market or in illegal circles. So security is a holding cost there. Going back to our logistics talk about warehousing, I might have climate control. If I have chemicals, I might have hazardous materials. So all that stuff kind of considerations goes into holding cost. And usually it has to do with the bigger the item because it takes up more space. And with space, my other costs grow, like electricity, like material handling to move that stuff around when I need it, those type of things. But it's not always has to do with space. Circuit cards, for example, is another item. Doesn't take up much space, but I might have some special handling. I might need some security. Weapons parts aren't necessarily huge, depending on the weapon you're talking about, but I need a lot of security, conversion kits, those kind of things. Now, on the other end of that balance is ordering and setup costs. Let's talk about ordering costs. So my favorite example of ordering costs is shipping. Okay. And I think that is the closest to home example for all of you. So let's say, for example, a great example, because we're all in quarantine and we still want to keep working out for our mental and physical well-being. So Kyle says, man, I want to order a kettlebell from Rogue Fitness. And Kyle just decides he wants a 70-pound kettlebell. Well, and let's just suppose that 70-pound kettlebell costs $70. Well, Kyle is probably going to pay $35 in shipping for that one kettlebell. Okay. So the ordering cost is actually pretty high. Now, if Kyle threw on a bunch of different items, as long as they're not more kettlebells, his shipping charge is probably not going to go up. So let's say Kyle said, okay, in addition to that kettlebell, I want a jump rope. I want a couple t-shirts. I want some resistance bands. His overall cost is going to go up just because of those additional items, but not so much because of additional shipping, because that other stuff doesn't weigh very much. Okay. So there's, and if Kyle was a retailer, let's say, every time Kyle ordered kettlebells from his supplier, he would probably have a high ordering cost. But let's just say Kyle said, I'm going to order kettlebells once a year and get it over with. Well, number one, he'd probably be able to get them in bulk. And number two, he'd pay that one shipping charge and be done with it. As opposed to like ordering one kettlebell a month, those shipping charges would just kill him over time. There's other things that go into ordering. So when you order something on the internet, any one of us orders something today, there's more than just shipping charges. Just to process your order, there's a charge for that is being passed on to you somehow, and you don't even know it. It's usually in the cost of the end item. So if I order this jacket and this jacket was $80, it didn't cost them $80 to make this jacket, but there is some cost in this jacket for them to process the order, to take my order off the internet and somebody to put it into their production and distribution system and then to track it. Okay, so there's an order processing cost, and then there's obviously a production cost as well. Especially, so I had some jerseys made a while back. We still do every now and then. And so the supplier I have, the first time we ordered these jerseys, he charged us a setup cost. The setup cost was that I said, hey, we want the jersey to look like this. And so he said, okay, we have to configure the machine this way. It's kind of like silk screening. We have to set up the machine for the first time, and it costs to do that. Once we start printing shirts, I'm either not charged that setup cost again. In my case, I wasn't. He charged me one time, and that was it. He's never charged us again. But then the more shirts that I buy, I can spread out that setup cost across those shirts. So, you know, these are the costs to kind of, I want to balance and say, is it worth it to buy a whole bunch at once? But then I got to hold them until I can move them, and that's going to cost me. Or is it just worth it to order them and get them when I need them? I won't incur the holding costs, but I will incur the setup and the ordering costs. And there's equations for this. There's equations in your chapter. In this class, I don't require you or ask you to produce any of those equations in that math. Again, as always, if you want to talk about how that's done quantitatively, I'm more than happy and excited to talk to you about that. But in general concept, those are the two costs that we're trying to balance. Just to bring one more simple example, pre-coronavirus, you might have a hobby that you do that has kind of consumable raw materials. Let's say you're an artist and you have paints. So you might say, and let's say the paint store is just down the street from you. So on one hand, you might say, hey, there's no need for me to keep paint on hand because it takes up space and sometimes paint expires. So when I need paint, I'll just go to the store and get it. But then if you're always going to the store, let's say you're going to the store 4 or 5 times a week, essentially that's a cost of you driving to the store to go get the paint. And so you may say, you know, it just makes more sense. Or the balance might be, hey, I don't keep a ton on hand at home, but I keep about an amount to take me through the week. And then at the end of the week on Saturday, I go back to the store and I get a new stock for the next week. And that kind of balances those two out. So enough said on that. The final bit we're going to talk about is these 3 terms. So lead time, demand during lead time, and a reorder point. And for this part of the discussion, I'm going to fire up my little pen right here. All right. So the 3 terms I want to talk about are lead time, demand during lead time, and reorder point. And I am going to try to do this. I think I can, and tie these all into one example. So let's say I'm running retail and Riley is my supplier. I got to draw Riley pretty accurately. He's a pretty tall dude. All right. So the first thing, and I'm talking about Lucky Charms. So I know that when I get Lucky Charms, I get them from Riley. And I know that from the time I order Lucky Charms to the time I get them from Riley is 7 days. Okay, that means I call Riley on a phone today and I say, Riley, my pen gets possessed sometimes. Sorry about that. I say, Riley, I need some Lucky Charms. And he goes, okay, no problem. From the time I place my order with him, I see Lucky Charms 7 days later. This 7 is lead time. Okay. And that concept is the same whether Riley is a supplier or a manufacturer. So let's say I'm ordering items directly from Riley. Also has another business where he manufactures items. And computers, let's say, and he's making them for me. I'm running another retail location, Best Buy, and I see that I'm running low on the Apple iMac. And so I say, Riley, I need 20 more Apple iMacs with these kind of configurations. And so assuming that I'm not asking for something out of the ordinary, and Riley has agreed to this 7 days, from the time I talk to him to the time I should see those computers is 7 days. Now, is lead time always 7 days? No, not at all. Lead time is lead time. Lead time is simply from the time I place the order to a supplier or manufacturer to when I see it. That's what lead time is. Now, let's talk about those Lucky Charms again. Oftentimes, this is how we set up inventory that is not safety stock, okay? So let's say I have a shelf that's 4 shelves high. And this is really a smart way to set up inventory. And each shelf contains the same amount of space or boxes. So let's say I have 4 shelves high, and each contains 100 boxes of Lucky Charms. And so what I do is I watch. So let's say I start the month with all my shelves full. So I watch. After the first week, this shelf is empty. I don't do anything. After the second week, this shelf is empty. And I call up Riley at the end of that second week. And let's say 7 days. Actually, I don't need to call up Riley just yet. Let's say the third week I let go by. At the end of that third week, I'm going to call up Riley and say, hey, Riley, I want you to bring 400 boxes of Lucky Charms. I need an order of 400 boxes. My reorder point in this example was 100. Okay. So inventory reorder point is a level. I'm waiting till my inventory gets down to that level before I submit a new order of 400. Under this model, if I call up Riley and say, hey, I need an order of 400, I'm going to see that 400 in 1 week. So at the end of this next week, my shelves are empty, but here comes Riley through the door with my 400, and he restocks my shelves, and I'm good for the next month. Now, to do this model, obviously, I got to count on Riley, and I got to count that demand is constant. But in either case, let's say I don't, I count on Riley, but I just want to be sure. Or let's say I don't know, we have a new type of Lucky Charms out. Well, I might have that safety stock over here in the back room of how much I think that demand is going to vary. And there's a number of ways mathematically to compute this, but let's just say I have a box of 200 in the back room. Well, if everything works to plan, I don't ever break that box of 200 open. I don't ever use it. Okay. Now, after a while, let's say this goes on and goes on. And after a while, I go back and check these boxes and I haven't opened them like in a year. Maybe I just need to get rid of the safety stock altogether. Okay. So I talked about reorder point. I talked about lead time. I didn't address demand during lead time, but that remaining 100 was my demand during lead time. So when I call up Riley and say, hey, I need an order, and I know that it's going to be 7 days until I see those Lucky Charms, 100 in this example is that last 100. It's not the inventory level. Those are still two different things. They look like the same number, but that's the amount of inventory I'm going to go through in that remaining week. Okay. Let's say that this was 120. Well, that's going to be a problem. If I waited till 100 to reorder and my demand during lead time is 120, I'm going to have 20 unhappy people. Or Jacob, who just came in to buy 20 boxes and he's unhappy. you know, but either way, I'm going to have some unhappy somebody unless I bust into my safety stock, and that's part of my plan. But good inventory management, my plan initially should not rely on busting into my safety stock. My plan should rely on what I know about my inventory. Okay, now if I know from Jump Street that my demand is varied, well, yeah, I'm going to have to bust into safety stock pretty quickly. And if I know from the get-go that my demand is varied, then I'm going to need a lot here in safety stock. But if I'm just the opposite and I have a really good sense of how demand is going to move, then I might not have anything over here. Okay, so to just quickly recap on these three, demand is the amount of time that passes from the time I talk to somebody higher up in the supply chain about what I need to the time that I get it. Okay, and this person could be a supplier, they could be a manufacturer. It all depends on that distribution network that I have. Demand during lead time means that I'm still going to incur demand during this lead time. Hopefully I didn't wait until I was out, because if I did, all I'm going to have is unhappy customers until I get that resupply. But the bottom line is I'm going to still incur demand during that time. Demand just doesn't stop. So that's what demand during lead time refers to. And then reorder point is the point at which I reorder. It isn't the amount, it's the point that triggers me to reorder. So in this instance, because I knew and I can count on Riley, regardless of how much I order, the lead time is 7 days. So I'm going to wait until I hit 100, and then I'm going to reorder, and I'm going to reorder the full stack, because at the end of the week when I'm done, he'll come in, he'll restock my shelf, I'll be back at 400, and I can keep on moving. So this is the last of what I've got for you all today. Any questions, any discussion on any of this, on inventory of what I've covered, what we've covered today, big or small? Okay. If there are no questions, then as always, I'll hang out until you all clear. If some folks want to stick around and ask questions about this stuff or anything else, and you don't want to necessarily ask it in front of everybody else, once everyone clears off the call today, I will post this video later and update Canvas with that. As a reminder, on Wednesday, we will not have a Zoom. You'll have a quiz on this material that will open up on Canvas quizzes. And with that, I hope you all have a great week. Thank you.